המילים החמות, כבוד הרבנים, כבוד הרבנים, כבוד השרים, כבוד השגרירים, ובמיוחד כבוד ניצולי השואה. It is you who endured the worst of man's inhumanity to man, and were able to emerge not only to build families, to build communities, but to make an enduring contribution to Israel, my own country, Canada, and across the world. I'm delighted to be able to participate in this common cause which brings us together today, which I take to be the struggle against hate, against atrocity, against indifference, against impunity, against the crime whose name we should even shudder to mention, genocide, and of the Shoah as a paradigmatic example of this ultimate evil. And meeting as we do today in Yad Vashem, which I take to be the crucible, the neshama, the lapid, the soul and the flame of remembrance and of action under its distinguished director, Dr. Avner Shalev. And meeting as we do as well on the centenary of Raoul Wallenberg, a person who has emerged really as a metaphor and message, and so described this morning, metaphor and message of Chasidei Umot HaOlam, whom the United Nations sometimes doesn't always know whom to honor, nonetheless referred to Raoul Wallenberg as the greatest humanitarian of the 20th century. This lost hero of humanity, who, as it happens, became also, and I'm proud to say this, the first honorary citizen of Canada. This disappeared hero of the Holocaust, who showed how one person can make a difference, how one person can confront evil, can resist evil, and can prevail over evil, and thereby transform history. His heroism included, and it has been mentioned today, but it does bear some recall and reaffirmation to appreciate how in the midst of horrors too terrible to be believed, but not too terrible to have happened, that Raoul Wallenberg was able to accomplish the incredible rescues that he did. The Schutzpasses that were mentioned, which provided diplomatic immunity to its recipients. I'm told that Raoul Wallenberg's crafting of the Schutzpass, the diplomatic passport which saved so many people, actually looked more authentic than the original. Yet another example of his statescraft. And by this initiative alone, which inspired other legations to follow and do the same thing, 20,000 Jews were saved. By the establishment of safe houses, diplomatic havens, 32 safe houses which provided sanctuary for those who then were the beneficiaries of that immunity. Again, other legations followed his example, and by this route alone, some 30,000 were saved. By the establishment of all the staples of humanitarian assistance, soup kitchens, healthcare places, to give a semblance of dignity to the elderly, the sick, the orphans, to provide that semblance of dignity amidst the horror. In October 1944, when the deportations, the mass deportations began, Wallenberg followed, again with that mixture of bluster and defiance and courage and handing out Schutzpasses, by that initiative alone, saving more hundreds. In November 1944, when the Arrow Cross government organized a death march, mainly for women and children, 125 kilometers, that Wallenberg followed with food, with medical supplies, with the Schutzpasses, again saving hundreds and hundreds of people. But his last rescue was perhaps the most memorable. When the Nazi generals were marching on the Budapest ghetto and were threatening to blow up the Budapest ghetto, murdering the 70,000 remnant of Hungarian Jews, it was Wallenberg, in again that mixture of moral courage and defiance, who said to Nazi General Schmidhaber that if they were to march on that Budapest ghetto, he would ensure that they would stand trial for their crimes. He would ensure that they would be brought to justice. And so they retreated. One might say that Wallenberg, at that moment, embodied and was a forerunner of the Nuremberg principles, just as he embodied the Talmudic idiom in the most profound sense, Hametzil Adam Echad Kilu Yitzil Olam Kulo, that if you save a single life, it is as if you have saved an entire universe, just as if you kill a single person, it is as if you have killed an entire universe. If I may read from the recent congressional testimony on the occasion of honoring Raoul Wallenberg, U.S. congressional testimony, where they have an excerpt of the testimony from Tommy Lapid, former, former, among other things, Minister of Justice here in Israel. As a young boy, he was staying with his mother in a Swedish safe house. His father was already dead. He gave an eyewitness account of how his family was helped by Wallenberg, and I quote, "One morning, a group of Hungarian fascists came into the house and said that all the able-bodied women must go with them. We knew what this meant. My mother kissed me, and I cried, and she cried. We knew we were parting forever, and she left me there, an orphan to all intents and purposes. Then 2 or 3 hours later, to my amazement, my mother returned with the other women. It seemed like a mirage, a miracle. My mother was there. She was alive, and she was hugging me and kissing me, and she said one word, Wallenberg, Wallenberg." One of many eyewitness testimonies, and I suspect there are people amongst us here today, Nitzulei HaShoah, the bearers of memory, who can share those testimonies as well. While Raoul Wallenberg saved so many, he was greeted not as the liberator he was, but disappeared into the Soviet Gulag in January 1945, never to be seen again, at least if you look at the Soviet report, which said that he died of a heart attack in 1947, later contradicted not as to year, but as to the cause of death, that he was murdered in 1947. I became chair of an international commission on the fate and whereabouts of Raoul Wallenberg in 1989. We reported in 1990. The other members of that commission, because it was representatives from each of the countries of Wallenberg's citizenship and honorary citizenship, included Professor Elie Wiesel from the United States, Professor Guy von Dardo, Wallenberg's brother from Sweden, Gideon Hausner, former Attorney General here in Israel, Zichrono Livracha, and my colleague Michael Shlenov from Russia. We reported in 1990, and I'm going to summarize it very quickly, but on the occasion of President Putin of Russia being here, I thought it might be appropriate just to summarize quickly our findings, which were confirmed, I might add, in a court case in the federal courts in the United States. Number one, that the evidence was incontrovertible, that Wallenberg did not die in 1947, as the Soviets claimed he did. Two, that the evidence was credible, that Wallenberg was alive in the 50s and 60s and even into the 70s and 80s. That Wallenberg, legally speaking, must be seen to have been a disappeared person. That the burden of proof with respect to what happened to Raoul Wallenberg rests, as we put it then, and as the court put it, on the Soviet Union, now in its successor form on Russia, but that they have yet to discharge that proof. I will give you one example. We visited Vladimir prison, which was regarded as being the center place of the witness testimony. We found when we were there that the Soviet Union at the time had not once in 45 years, ever visited Vladimir prison, ever questioned any of the inmates, ever examined any of the archives, ever looked at any of the witness testimony and documentary evidence. And so I say today in 2012, Russia still owes us an accounting with respect to what happened to Raoul Wallenberg. The time has come for Russia to open up the archives so that the real truth can be shared with the international community, and those who did not liberate him at the time as he had liberated others, but rather imprisoned him, should now themselves share in the necessary accountability. Let me now, the balance of my remarks are inspired by what Avner Shalev said this morning, and that is that Raoul Wallenberg's humanitarian legacy cannot be disconnected from the Shoah. It is, in fact, inextricably bound up with the lessons of the Shoah. And it's only in understanding, in remembering and understanding the lessons of the Shoah through the prism of Raoul Wallenberg, today we can appreciate the larger reasons for our gathering and for our action. And the first imperative, always, Yad Vashem stands for. The first imperative is that of Zachor, that of the imperative of memory, what the French call le devoir de mémoire, the duty of remembrance. As I said, of remembering horrors too terrible to be believed, but not too terrible to have happened. Of the Holocaust as a war against the Jews, in which, as Professor Elie Wiesel has put it so succinctly and so well, not all victims were Jews, but all Jews were targeted victims, defamed, defiled, dehumanized as prologue and justification for their mass murder. And that, therefore, is the greatness of Hasidei Umot Olam. Raoul Wallenberg and all those whom he represents, all of whom are commemorated here at Yad Vashem. And so forth, this notion, therefore, of remembrance, as Rabbi Lau tells us, also the importance of Kol Yisrael Arevim Zeh Bazeh, that we are each, whoever we are, the guarantors of each other's destiny. The first lesson from Zachor, from Raoul Wallenberg. The second, and this is not that well known, but in looking into it, I found that Raoul Wallenberg had, during his period that he was in Haifa, had learned from speaking with Jewish refugees who had fled and had come to Israel, of the culture of hate that took us down the road to the Holocaust and genocide. And so the second lesson here is that the enduring lesson of the Shoah and the genocides that have occurred since then was that these genocides did not simply occur because of the machinery of death, but they occurred because of this state-sanctioned teaching of contempt. It was this teaching of contempt, this demonizing of the other, this is where it all began. As the Supreme Court of Canada put it in a case looking into Holocaust denial and the like, when they said, and it's been affirmed in subsequent international judgments with respect to Rwanda and former Yugoslavia, they said, the Holocaust did not begin in the gas chambers. It began with words. These, as the court put it, are the catastrophic effects of racism. These, as the court put it, are the chilling facts of history. And I regret today to say, but we would be learning nothing from the past if I did not say this. I'm saying it here today in Yad Vashem, that we are witnessing yet again a state-sanctioned incitement to hate and genocide whose epicenter is Ahmadinejad's Iran. And I use that term to distinguish it from the people and publics of Iran who are otherwise themselves the targets of mass domestic repression in Iran. Let there be no mistake about it. And I say this as somebody who chaired an international coalition regarding the responsibility to prevent. Let there be no mistake about it. Iran, and this was our finding of fact and conclusion of law, Iran has already committed, I repeat, already committed, the crime of incitement to genocide prohibited under the Genocide Convention. Yet as we meet, I regret to say that not one state party to the Genocide Convention has undertaken any of the mandated legal remedies. These are not policy options. These are legal obligations to bring the perpetrators of the state-sanctioned incitement to genocide to account. And I hope in learning the lessons, and in this second lesson of the danger of state-sanctioned incitement to genocide, we'll not only remember this lesson, but act upon it, which leads me inexorably into the third lesson, the dangers of indifference. The dangers of crimes of indifference of the bystanders. And I mentioned with respect to the contemporary state-sanctioned incitement to genocide. But let us also recall that we are meeting today on the 18th anniversary of the genocide in Rwanda, the unspeakable genocide in Rwanda. I say unspeakable because this genocide was preventable. Nobody can say that we did not know. We knew, but we did not act. And in 3 months, from April to June 1994, 1 million Rwandans were killed. Mostly ethnic Tutsis, some moderate Hutus. No one can say that we did not know. One has only to read the deliberations of the UN Security Council at that time, which is a monument to dithering and delay. And with regard to Darfur, nobody can say that we did not know. We knew, but we did not act. And so I say with regard to this third lesson, the dangers of indifference and inaction, that regrettably, we live at a time where too few people are prepared to stand up and be counted. Raoul Wallenberg, one person, who, as I said, confronted radical evil and transformed history, tells us the lessons of shattering these crimes of indifference, these conspiracies of silence that beset and burden us today. A fourth lesson, and that is combating mass atrocity and the culture of impunity, bringing the perpetrators to justice. If the 20th century was the age of atrocity, it was also the age of impunity. Few of the perpetrators, few of the Nazi perpetrators and their collaborators, tragically, were brought to justice. And regrettably, this culture of impunity continues today. I'm only going to give two of many examples. With regard to Sudan, the three leaders in Sudan, led by President al-Bashir, were indicted by the International Criminal Court for their war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide in Darfur. That's the important good news of holding people accountable. The bad news is that not only have not one of them been brought to justice, but as we meet, we are seeing yet again a triangular assault undertaken by these same three people, which include also Ahmed Hayoun, who was then the minister in the interior in the government that perpetrated the genocide in Darfur, now the governor of South Kordofan. And as we meet now, there is a triangular assault being undertaken by the Sudanese government against South Kordofan, against the Blue Nile state, against the Abyei region. I can go on. Culture of impunity continues. And one example taken from Iran. If I mention the name Ahmed Vahidi, it may not mean much to many people here. It should. Ahmed Vahidi is today the Minister of Defense in Iran, presiding over the Iranian nuclear weaponization program. But Ahmed Vahidi was the person named by the Argentinian judiciary as having been responsible for organizing, orchestrating, and implementing the assault on the AMIA, the Jewish Community Center, in Argentina in 1994, which the Argentinian Minister of Justice told me was the worst terrorist atrocity in Argentina since the end of the Second World War. Was Ahmed Vahidi brought to justice? No. He was rewarded with being the Minister of Defense in Iran, presiding over the nuclear weaponization program, and even though there is an Interpol arrest warrant issued at the request of the Argentinian authorities, he remains still free and still presiding over a weaponization program. Which brings me now, moving to a close, the fifth lesson now, and that is la trahison d'éclair, the responsibility to speak truth to power. Again, Nazism succeeded not only because of the reasons I have given, state-sanctioned incitement to genocide, culture of indifference, and the like, but because of the trahison d'éclair, the betrayal of the elites, teachers, educators, church leaders, judges, lawyers, engineers, architects, and the like. One has to only read Mueller's book on Hitler's justice to see the complicity of judges and lawyers in the Third Reich. One has to only read Proctor's book to see how the medical profession was implicated in the Third Reich, including how many of them were involved in being the gatekeepers at the death camps. One has to only read books here to see the manner in which our engineers and architects were involved in the minute details of the construction of the death camps. As Elie Wiesel put it so well, what this showed us is that intellectuals can both love poems and kill children. And so the betrayal by the elites is something that we must remember, and the importance of holding elites accountable. And that juxtaposes with what I mentioned regarding Sudan and Iran and the culture of impunity. The sixth lesson is the vulnerability of the powerless and the powerless of the vulnerable, the responsibility to protect. You know, one of the great normative international law doctrines proclaimed by the UN Security Council in 2005 was the responsibility to protect. That whenever you have a case of war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, the targeting of the powerless, and a state in which this is occurring is unable or unwilling to do anything about it, or as in the case of Syria today, is actually the author of those crimes, there is a responsibility on the international community to intervene and protect. But as Rabbi Lau put it so well, this is anchored in Lo ta'amod al dam re'acha. Thou thou shalt not stand idly by while thy brothers and sisters' blood is being shed. Let me go to the last lesson, and with this I close. And that is the danger of anti-Semitism. What the Shoah teaches us here, and what Raoul Wallenberg himself in his writings understood and appreciated so well, was the phenomenon, really, of anti-Semitism as a paradigmatic representation of hatred. Jews died in Auschwitz, in the death camps, but tragically, anti-Semitism did not die. And anti-Semitism is still with us, and Jews and others continue to die because of anti-Semitism. As we know only too well, while it may begin with Jews, it doesn't end with Jews. And so may I conclude by saying that when one looks at the life and the legacy, the humanitarian legacy of Raoul Wallenberg, one sees in it, in terms of the enormity of that legacy, that in a manner in which he saved so many thousands in the horrors of war, he was really the precursor of what we today call international humanitarian law. In the organization of the safe havens, in the matter of his Schutzpasses, he was the forerunner of what today we call diplomatic protection, humanitarian intervention in the best sense. In his warning to the Nazi generals, he was a forerunner of what today we call international criminal law. And in becoming the Swedish non-Jew who in 4 months saved more Jews than, and this is a staggering data but happens to be the case, than any other single government in Hungary in 4 months in 1944. He not only showed what one person can do, but lived, embodied that Talmudic idiom of Hametzil, Adam Echad, Kilu Yitzil, Olam Kulo. So my hope is that this symposium today will not only be an act of remembrance, which it is on the centenary of Raoul Wallenberg, but it will be also a remembrance to act inspired by that humanitarian legacy, so that when we say never again, it's not simply idle rhetoric. It means